quickly engraved by Cruden, probably the most famous engraver of his generation, and then is widely circulated and becomes a cause célèbre.
The public scandal generated by Wakefield's discoveries inside a hospital so shrouded in secrecy was ironic, as during the previous century, Bedlam had been a famous tourist attraction. Bedlam was originally founded in 1247 by returning crusader Simon Fitzmary as a priory to provide refuge for London's insane. It stood in Bishopsgate, on the site of what's now Liverpool Street Station.
Bethlem's traditional role was very much a concern with the pauper insane, and the first real record of there being lunatics at Bethlem was around the early 15th century, where there's a record recording 6 mad folks in Bethlem.
Bedlam strangely benefited from the Great Fire of London in 1666. Its governors, forced for the first time by the loss of their homes actually to live in the hospital's cramped accommodation themselves, realized how inadequate the building was. Part of the new London that rose from the ashes 10 years later was a spectacular new Bedlam in Moorfields, lavishly designed by Robert Hooke. As the public looked out upon this palatial building, some questioned whether its very design had been dreamt up by madmen.
The governors decided to move this very nondescript institution into the most spectacular building, one of the greatest buildings London saw that entire century. We do have a poem written soon after its opening, where the building is described as a danger to public mental health. So brave, so sweet, so neat, it does appear, the poem goes, everyone will want to live there.
New Bethlem was often commented on by contemporaries as a palace for lunatics. Effectively, you also have a statement of the hospital wanting to draw visitors in, being about creating a spectacle, creating to some extent an attraction.
There's no doubt that Bethlem was on the tourist trail. We start to get guidebooks published, including in French, which is interesting, and along with other sites of London, Bethlem is regularly listed.
Bedlam's experiment in tourism would last for 90 years. Initially, the hospital's governors hoped the experience would serve as a high-minded education for its visitors.
Insanity is very much seen as a legitimate public spectacle in this period. People were seeing Bedlam as a way of being shown humanity within its most pitiable and degraded form, and it being given a moral lesson and exemplum through that visit, so that seeing those people who have been driven mad by the indulgence of passions, of alcohol, of diet, of pride, of lust, was very much kind of a warning of the madness that lurked within all of us.
Because the inmates of Bedlam were so starved of attention, were so neglected, for some of them, having members of the public coming in who they could interact with and sing and dance and converse with and shout at, would have been therapeutic, something that they wanted. But the point is, they didn't have a choice. And for everyone who would have felt like that, there was probably at least one for whom being on public display was excruciatingly shameful and painful.
Bedlam's governors had shrewdly calculated that mass tourism would generate a healthy income for the hospital.
Every person who visited Bedlam passed through the penny gates and had to put a few pennies into 2 life-size models of gypsies dressed in the Bethlem colours.
Visiting was not just a source of income for the governors, it was a source of income for patients, some of whom had ways of trying to solicit charity from the visitors.
They would quite often offer to sell them poetry which they'd written, written by sort of genuine lunatics, or to sing songs for them, and quite often they'd, demand a penny for a song, and they'd usually demand a penny up front and then sing their little ditty. And it may be that our whole idea of picking up something for a song, picking up something very cheap, comes from this interaction.
Often, Bedlam was just one stop-off in a day of London sightseeing that included visiting the theatre or the wild animals on show in the Tower of London. The visitors came from across the social spectrum, where unsupervised they could drink and mingle with the patients, known as Bedlamites, for hours on end.
Bethlem wanted its visitors to be the respectable sort, the visitors of quality. Of course, this sort of ideal visitor can't really be seen as the typical visitor. And there's plenty of evidence that, in fact, that visiting was characterised by a much more motley assemblage of people. At Easter holidays, Whitsun holidays in particular, visiting was much more difficult to control, governor's minutes themselves reflect a concern with riotous behaviour at these holiday times in particular. Some visitors were, perhaps in moral terms, could be seen to be more irrational, more mad, more degraded in moral terms than the patients they were regarding.
What happened was that visiting became seen as increasingly down market. Put it this way, something else you could do in London was go to Bridewell Hospital, Bethlem's sister institution, and attend the whippings of harlots. Bethlem became consigned to the harlot whipping category of public entertainment.
And now the rabble to thee does resort, that thy want of wits may be their sport.
The Rake's Progress. William Hogarth's shocking depiction of the asylum during a public visit was part of a growing trend by artists and writers for whom Bedlam was an irresistible and compelling subject. One of the shrewdest observers was Ned Ward, who wrote a satirical column for a magazine entitled The London Spy.
Ned Ward, in a sense, was the tabloid hack of his day. He had a beady eye and he chronicled the misdoings of his fellow man, and he described Bedlam as a dry walk for loiterers.
And all I can say of Bedlam is that it's a promenade of rogues, a showing room for harlots, a sure market for lectures, and a dry walk for loiterers.
Ned Ward gives an account in the early 18th century of touring Bedlam and interviewing patients. And one of the patients he interviewed gives a long account of how Bedlam effectively is where you are free to speak your mind without correction.
One of the Bedlamites was holding forth with such vehemence against the kingly government that I told him he deserved to be hanged for talking of treason.
Now you are a fool, says he, for we madmen have as much privilege of speaking our minds within these walls. And that's more than you dare do.
After a series of encounters, Ned Ward came to the conclusion that really Bedlam was the only place where you could say what you liked and not get locked up under sedition laws because you were already under lock and key. So the real freedom of speech existed with the mad.
Before Bedlam's bold experiment in unsupervised public tourism ended in 1770, many visitors were left asking themselves the same question. Where was the sanest place to be? Inside or outside Bedlam's walls? But for the inmates themselves, a new regime would bring growing isolation, secrecy, and fear. In 1770, after 90 years as one of London's most popular and rowdy tourist destinations, Bedlam's governors finally closed the doors to mass public visits. But for the inmates, this was a mixed blessing. Over the next 40 years, the hospital became increasingly cut off from the outside world.
Bethlem, ironically, for one that used to be castigated for being too available to the viewing public, was now becoming the object of suspicion as a place where there might be secret corners that no one saw, where people were kept strapped up, quite literally, for years on end.
In 1795, John Haslam was brought in to oversee Bedlam. The new chief apothecary was a man keen to impose his own no-nonsense views on the emergent world of what was known as mad doctoring.
He was ambitious, he had great hopes for the future of mad doctoring and for the possibility of a cure of mad people, but he believed that this cure could only happen once the doctor had imposed his will entirely on the patient.
To listen to what the patient says, to attempt to reason with him, is to head promptly down the darkest of blind alleys. One might as well try to cure the blind by showing them beautiful pictures.
The 17th and 18th century was a period when approaches to madness tend to emphasize principles of the employment of fear and intimidation. So it was commonly understood that the mad required cowing, that the mad could be understood as relatively cunning, liable to violence very suddenly, and one couldn't turn one's back, sort of that sort of view. So it was very important to establish a mastery over the patient.
John Haslam shared some responsibility for the running of Bedlam with the hospital's chief surgeon, Brian Crowther, who had his own views about how to get inside the heads of the patients in his charge.
Crowther's duties were really bleeding and purging and shaving, but his passion was for the brains of lunatics.
Crowther was an alarming figure because he was given to performing dissections of patients' brains in the mortuary. By modern standards, His forensics were a quite legitimate method of examining whether there was an organic cause of insanity. But it was very easy, obviously, to make a case for his being some kind of a sinister Dr. Frankenstein type person.
Like other 18th century asylums, Bedlam employed a variety of what today seem macabre treatments on its patients. At the time, these were seen as rational therapies that could treat madness by various methods of purging and shocking. One such treatment that struck terror into patients in Bedlam was euphemistically known as cold bathing.
Cold bathing became an increasingly popular way of treating madness at that from the belief that the bodily system might require immersion within a very, very cold bath, and to some extent the patient might need shocking.
Other extreme therapies were dreamt up for controlling and purging the patients. One such treatment involved a device called the rotating chair.
The idea was that the poor patient would be swung round and round, rather like somebody on a fairground ride, and the action of being swung round to the point where they vomited and possibly defecated themselves at the same time would actually make them sane. I can only say that it sounded a very cruel and barbaric way of attempting to instill any kind of sanity in anyone.
Case notes reflect the fact that patients were sometimes threatened with a chair, and this would suffice on its own to quieten their behaviour at times. So the chair was itself used as a form of intimidation tactics, not just as a form of therapeutics.
Rumours of the brutal methods inside Bedlam increased public sympathy for the mad, and coincided with a growing fascination for the personal stories of certain Bedlamites.
There's also tremendous appetite for scandal, which of course remains with us to this day, so that notorious characters will be followed, and one can see the same thing in the treatment of characters such as Margaret Nicholson.
Margaret Nicholson was a maidservant who'd been jilted by her lover and fallen on hard times. She'd then gone on to develop the unshakable belief that she should be on the throne of England. Nicholson became an instant celebrity in 1786 when she made a very public attempt on the life of King George III as he greeted crowds near the Palace of St. James's.
She reached into her gown and produced a dessert knife. Well, at this point, all hell broke loose. She was wrestled to the ground by armed guards. George got the hang of the whole thing immediately. He just said,
I am not hurt. Please, take care of the poor woman. Do not hurt her.
She was sentenced, as it were, to live in Bethlem for the rest of her life, more than 40 years.
Mass public visits may have ended 16 years earlier, but for the great and the good, private tours of Bedlam continue to be popular.
Nicholson then subsequently becomes a kind of star attraction. A French visitor who visited Bedlam in the 1780s gives an account of having to deal with the frisson of meeting one of Bedlam's most famous patients, but with a woman who seemed to be frightening and to have cold, steely eyes.
in a sense, Margaret Nicholson did become a celebrity just as she wanted. People really wanted to visit her. She was written of. She was treated as Bedlam royalty.
Just 1 year after Nicholson was transferred to Bedlam, she received some unexpected news. The king she tried to murder was just as mad as she was.
When King George's mind started to unravel in 1788, the court doctors were unable to do anything for him.
There's a constitutional crisis as well, because if the king was mad, then what on earth was going to happen to the rest of the country? The king's physicians had given up. They were frightened that if they went too far in their treatment of him, it would be regarded as treason. They were scared of him.
I have asked myself this many times, and no one has given me an answer yet. Where is the reason for this reason?
Eventually, recourse was made to a doctor from the provinces, Reverend Dr. Francis Willis, who had a reputation for being able to treat the mad effectively and even to cure madness. He himself claimed that he could cure madness in 9 out of 10 cases.
Like John Haslam, the Bedlam apothecary, Willis believed in total mastery over his patients, and King George was to be no exception.
Willis was a great believer in what he called the eye, He believed that he had this power to stare down any lunatic if they got violent or uncontrolled. And some people were sceptical about this.
So please, explain to me this power that so instantaneously terrifies His Majesty into obedience. Place the candles between us, and I'll give you the answer. There, sir, by the eye, I should have looked at him. Thus, sir. Thus.
No more questions were asked.
But I have said before that the time...
Basically, Willis, as he would with any of his other patients, Willis set out to break George's spirit. And the way he achieved this was through straitjackets.
Your Majesty.
Another option was a chair, which George regarded as kind of a throne, in a sardonic sense. He had the additionally unpleasant experience of having leeches applied, because leeches, it was believed, by sucking the blood, would also suck out the poison of his madness.
After 6 weeks at the royal retreat at Kew, it was reported that Willis's strict regime was yielding results, and the king was proclaimed cured in the spring of 1789. The king's harrowing experience continued to shape a growing public sympathy for the plight of the mad, and this would soon have dramatic repercussions for the future of Bedlam.
The madness of King George focused popular attention on madness, the condition, and its therapy in ways that had never happened before. So for the first time, really, people started to focus on the question of whether it could be treated and possibly even cured.
But in 1789, as official medals were being struck to commemorate the king's return to sanity, and Francis Willis was rewarded with his governorship of Bedlam, seismic events on the other side of the English Channel would blur and confuse the whole definition of madness. And once again, Bedlam would find itself at the center of events. During the 18th century, Bedlam had come to symbolize the very idea of madness in Britain, inspiring fear, pity, and fascination right across the social scale. But in 1789, as King George III recovered from his own bout of insanity, the outbreak of the French Revolution meant the fear of madness took on a much more political and dangerous dimension.
What had happened in France threatened the entire British establishment. It threatened the monarchy, it threatened the church, it threatened the parliamentary system and the aristocracy.
There was a strong conviction that political upheavals could drive people mad through anxiety, and James Tilly Matthews' case seems to be the perfect instance of this.
What we have offered to France is a fair...
James Tilly Matthews, from the few details that we know before his confinement in Bedlam, was a tea broker. He had an office in Leadenhall Street, so he was, as far as we can tell, a successful young businessman with a young family out in Camberwell.
There is not the slightest grounds for the Directory to have terminated negotiations so abruptly.
On the 30th of December 1796, there was a big debate in the House of Commons about the possibility of peace with France.
The obstinacy and the arrogant pretensions of the enemy.
Britain had been at war with France for 3 years. At this point, it transpired there had been secret peace negotiations going on, and these were being discussed.
The calamities of war can be imputed only to the unjust.
At a crucial point in these negotiations, in a packed chamber, in the visitors' gallery, James Tilly Matthews stood up. James Tilly Matthews was taken away, and after 10 days, he was transferred to Bedlam. The man into whose care Matthews was entrusted was John Haslam, the apothecary.
For the ambitious Haslam, desperate to make his mark on the competitive world of mad doctoring, his new patient offered a world of possibility.
When Matthews was questioned about why he'd accused the Home Secretary of treason, he said that he had in fact been a double agent between the British and French government, and now the British government were washing their hands of him, denying all knowledge of the peace negotiations that he'd been involved in.
But as Haslam was soon to discover, there was considerably more to Matthews' version of events.
Matthews believed that a large conspiracy was focused on keeping him quiet, and he believed that that conspiracy was being orchestrated by an extraordinary machine called an air loom, which had the power to beam thoughts and feelings into his brain and to control his mind.
Matthews repeatedly described the workings of the heirloom to Haslam. It was a huge machine operated by a sinister gang of French agents and fueled by barrels of fetid effluvia. Like a vast silk loom, it would then weave together invisible gases to produce powerful magnetic rays. He believed the heirloom had the power not only to control Haslam and Matthews themselves, but to change the course of history by controlling the actions of the entire government of Prime Minister William Pitt. Despite Matthews' delusional beliefs, over the next 18 years, a battle royal would take place over his sanity between Matthews' family on one side and John Haslam and Bedlam on the other.
Matthews' friends and family brought two doctors, wonderfully named Clutterbuck and Birkbeck, to give their professional opinion of his condition, and both pronounced him sane.
I have attempted by every mode of examination I could devise.
I could not discover anything that indicated insanity in James Tilly Matthews, and I verily believe him to be perfectly sane.
Tilly Matthews is not insane.
But John Haslam fiercely disagreed.
It is my positive and decided opinion, as a result of taking considerable pains to examine the patient, that he is in a most deranged state of intellect, and wholly unfit to be at large.
Despite Haslam's unwavering belief in Matthews' insanity, he recognized his patient as an educated man, allowing him to tend a small plot in the hospital garden. But unbeknown to Matthews, Haslam's kindnesses masked his own distinct agenda.
Haslam spent a lot of time in Matthews' cell, asking him about his delusions, taking notes about them, getting Matthews to write up his version of what was going on, and Haslam eventually published this in a book called Illustrations of Madness.
Illustrations of Madness brought Haslam the attention he craved. It described the heirloom, setting out in Matthews' own words how it worked in great detail.
The patient so describes kiting. This is a very singular and distressing mode of assailment, and much practiced by the gang.
As boys, braves are quite in the air. So these wretches, by means of the heirloom and magnetic impregnations, contrive to lift into the brain some idea which floats and undulates in the intellect and fixes his attention to the exclusion of all other thoughts.
Haslam's pioneering work would become famous as the first complete psychiatric study of a single patient in medical history. The book presents Matthews' delusions in terms that resemble a modern diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. In the book, Haslam even manages to cast doubt on the sanity of doctors Clutterbuck and Birkbeck.
How they could fail to detect his insanity is inexplicable. Even the other lunatics had not the slightest difficulty in recognizing it. It appears wonderful that two opposite opinions could be entertained on the subject.
Haslam's book had finally got him noticed, and he'd won the battle to keep his patient inside Bedlam. As a form of unspoken gratitude from doctor to patient, Matthews was allowed more freedom to work inside the hospital.
He was given a private cell, and he was also given pen and paper, and he started to write and to draw, producing extraordinary body of images, the first of which we have. This is an engraving of the heirloom itself. There's something particularly uncanny about his heirloom, because it doesn't look like the work of a lunatic. It looks like the kind of thing that you might stumble upon if you opened an 18th century encyclopedia. What's extraordinary about the heirloom is this idea that seems to originate with Matthews, that his mind is being controlled by a machine. There are previous examples in history of people who maybe were suffering from similar conditions, but they're almost all explained within a religious frame, possession by the devil in someone's head. It seems that Matthews, for whatever reason, when this starts to happen to him, his assumption is not that he's part of some cosmic or religious drama. His assumption is that this is something that's being done to him by evil human agents in possession of cutting-edge technology.
Matthews may have been confined in Bedlam for over 10 years, but his family hadn't given up on their efforts to secure his release. Their repeated appeals forced extraordinary new evidence to come to light, which seemed to confirm that some of Matthews' conspiracy theories were not so deluded after all.
The Bethlem governors produced a letter from Lord Liverpool, the Home Secretary, saying,
"Gentlemen, I recommend that you do continue to detain in your hospital, as a fit and proper subject, James Tilly Matthews."
The fact that there should still be pressure from the very highest levels of government to keep Matthews locked up does suggest that there was some kind of political conspiracy, that he was genuinely being silenced. and raised suggestions that actually Bedlam was not what it appeared. It was not a charitable institution for pauper lunatics. It was a kind of, as it were, a sort of Guantanamo Bay, where enemies of the political elite could be held without charge indefinitely.
As Matthews was left to contemplate life imprisonment, he increasingly turned his attention to the crumbling building around him. Grand old Bedlam at Moorfields was sinking into the ground.
It had no foundations, there were no ties between the wall, enormous great cracks had opened up. The windows were unglazed, so in the winter it was extraordinarily cold. Matthews seems to have suffered from frostbite and developed abscesses on his back from the cold.
Bedlam's governors, facing the urgent need for a new building, decided that a public competition should be held to find the best design for the new hospital.
Extraordinarily, one of the people who submitted plans was James Tilly Matthews himself, who submitted a set of drawings which were not only beautifully executed, but also had this extraordinary perspective because they were written from the point of view of a Bedlam inmate, of a lunatic. Not an architect saying what the building ought to look like, but somebody with a really hard-won understanding of what life in Bedlam was like and how it could be improved. When the competition was finally judged, Matthews's plans didn't make it into the top 3, but he was given a special payment of £50 in recognition for his efforts, and this must have been, I suppose, the first good thing that had happened to Matthews for many, many years.
The third Bedlam was built in Lambeth. It is the building that's now the Imperial War Museum. It was an amalgam of various different plans that emerged from the public competition. Much of it is in line with what James Tilly Matthews was proposing, such as bigger windows and improved ventilation.
It may be that there are one or two particular details, the circular lawn, for example, in front, that are actually taken directly from Matthews' plans themselves.
But Matthews wouldn't quite live to see the new hospital he'd worked so hard to influence. In January 1815, just months before Bedlam was scheduled to move, he would die from the tuberculosis that had set in during his 18 years in the damp and freezing old Moorfields building. But it wasn't just the old Moorfields hospital that was crumbling. John Haslam's secretive regime was tottering too. Quaker philanthropist Edward Wakefield's investigation had caused a scandal. Following pressure from parliamentarians outraged at Wakefield's report on conditions inside Bedlam, in 1815 the Parliamentary Inquiry on Madhouses was convened.
It's the largest inquiry into madness and the treatment of madness that's ever happened, never occurred. It's unparalleled.
It wasn't long before John Haslam himself was called to give evidence.
John Haslam, of course, tries to give his own account of why this restraint has happened.
And for how long was the unfortunate lunatic kept in this fashion?
He was restrained for a period of 12 years for the safety of the other inmates.
And the inquiry then results in the lid effectively being taken off Bedlam in a much more demanding way.
Are we to understand that your chief surgeon, in a state of some inebriation, and quite without medical necessity, was in the habit of performing operations on deceased lady patients, and even removing their heads?
You also find, to their discredit, the medical men not closing ranks as effectively as they begin to divide ranks. And this is typified by John Haslam giving an account of the surgeon, Brian Crowther, something that causes clear shock and surprise to the committee.
So are you saying that your chief surgeon, Brian Crowther, was himself mad?
I am afraid to report, sir, that for 10 years he was often so drunk and insane as to require the regular use of a strait waistcoat, as his hand was not obedient to his will.
Rather worryingly for a barber surgeon, whom, the main qualification was to be able to hold a straight razor steady, it transpired that Brian Crowther was an alcoholic, and certainly Crowther's signature, when you see it on any of the Bedlam documents, is very alarming.
Haslam was sacked as a result of the inquiry into Norris's treatment and subsequent demise, and Haslam does appear to have had some kind of a breakdown and gone around telling people that everyone in the world was mad and the world was mad, etc., etc.
This sensational scandal would have a revolutionary effect, not just on Bedlam, but on the treatment of madness itself. The days of the rotating chair were coming to an end. and a new regime with very different ideas would soon be in charge of the hospital. The scandal surrounding the 1815 parliamentary inquiry had rocked Bedlam to its foundations. As the public view of how the mad should be treated began to change, so did Bedlam and its Bedlamites. Under a new regime, and the grandest of domes, the madhouse was to become middle class.
What was really happening was the gradual realisation that locking people up, isolating them, purging them, beating them, and depriving them of all human society was not the way to address this condition.
In 1852, Bedlam was placed under the supervision of a reforming mad doctor. William Hood was 28 years old and the hospital's first resident physician superintendent.
Walking into Bethlem under Hood was like going into another world. It was as if it had received a magical change. For instance, if you went to the women's ward, you would see paintings on the walls, birds singing in cages, fruit magazines, activities such as playing a musical instrument or basket making, watercolours. Every effort was made to make this a welcoming and caring environment. It was a world away from the noisy clangor of the previous Bedlam. Under Hood, with his reforming genius, the frantic and the wild were separated from the quieter patients. Criminal wings were set up for people who were violent and noisy, and an increasing proportion of middle-class patients whose families could pay were brought into Bedlam because Hood recognised that while there were forms of violent madness, there's also an increasing form of depression occurring in the middle classes who could no longer pay their bills or keep their jobs. And these were also patients who could be cured.
It is on the middle classes of society that the calamities incidental to madness fall most severely. They depend for existence on the continued power of being industrious. If the mind fails, that power is lost, and all the evils of poverty gradually surround them.
Hood was one of many Victorian mad doctors who believed in the new approach to treating the mad, known as moral management, a system that had proved successful in Quaker-influenced asylums in the previous century.
According to the precepts of moral management, there wasn't much that doctors could do for the insane, and what they really needed was pastoral care. Patients should be socialised, should be brought into the outside world.
The quality of the patient's recreation was seen as paramount, and by the 1850s, musical balls were held on a monthly basis.
The balls that were put on at Bedlam were part of a programme to prepare the patients really for going back to the real world and to help them with their social skills. Well, there's a fancy dress ball at Bedlam in 1859, and the London Illustrated News described it as looking really like any kind of a ball. It was very difficult to tell whether the people dancing and waltzing around nicely were doctors or nurses or patients.
Seeing these poor, crazy people, many young and comely, all of them peaceful and well-behaved, thus dancing and making merry, one feels inclined to ask whether they be really mad. And whether it might be expedient forthwith to unlock the gates of Bedlam and let the patients loose on the world again.
These must have been very curious occasions, because the Illustrated London News referred to such soirees as disconcerting in the sense that people were behaving beautifully and the girls were dancing in their nice gowns, but there was always the feeling that the back of the picture, the manacles and the mattresses and the restraints were not far away.
You feel in the midst of the merriment that there is something wanting, that the wine is corked, that the cake has a leaven of madness in it, that there is only 11pence halfpenny out of the shilling in the pockets of the dancers.
And there's also the realisation that, yes, these were patients, but these were the patients on display. So for every patient here, there were probably other patients hidden away somewhere who were not able to come to the ball and who, indeed, would never go to the ball.
William Hood continued to promote a regime that embraced liberal ideas and new therapies. Artist Richard Dadd, who'd been committed to Bedlam's criminal wing for life after brutally murdering his father with a razor, produced some of his finest works during his years in the hospital.
Instead of just locking him up and throwing away the key, Dad was given a large, airy room where he could paint. He was given
Century. We do have a poem written soon after its opening, where the building is described as a danger to public mental health. So brave, so sweet, so neat, it does appear, the poem goes, everyone will want to live there.
New Bethlem was often commented on by contemporaries as a palace for lunatics. Effectively, you also have the statement of the hospital wanting to draw visitors in, being about creating a spectacle, creating to some extent an attraction.
There's no doubt that Bethlem was on the tourist trail. We start to get guidebooks published, including in French, which is interesting, and along with other sites of London, Bethlem is regularly listed.
Bedlam's experiment in tourism
Is quickly engraved by Cruden, probably the most famous engraver of his generation, and then is widely circulated and becomes a cause célèbre.
The public scandal generated by Wakefield's discoveries inside a hospital so shrouded in secrecy was ironic, as during the previous century, Bedlam had been a famous tourist attraction. Bedlam was originally founded in 1247 by returning crusader Simon Fitzmary as a priory to provide refuge for London's insane. It stood in Bishopsgate, on the site of what's now Liverpool Street Station.
Bethlem's traditional role was very much a concern with the pauper insane. And the first real record of there being lunatics at Bethlem was around the early 15th century, where there's a record recording 6 mad folks in Bethlem.
Bedlam strangely benefited from the Great Fire of London in 1666. Its governors, forced for the first time by the loss of their homes actually to live in the hospital's cramped accommodation themselves, realized how inadequate the building was. Part of the new London that rose from the ashes 10 years later was a spectacular new Bedlam in Moorfields, lavishly designed by Robert Hooke. As the public looked out upon this palatial building, some questioned whether its very design had been dreamt up by madmen.
The governors decided to move this very nondescript institution into the most spectacular building, one of the greatest buildings London saw that entire
Would last for 90 years. Initially, the hospital's governors hoped the experience would serve as a high-minded education for its visitors.
Insanity is very much seen as a legitimate public spectacle in this period. People were seeing Bedlam as a way of being shown humanity within its most pitiable and degraded form, and it being given a moral lesson and exemplum through that visit, so that seeing those people who had been driven mad by the indulgence of passions, of alcohol, of diet, of pride, of lust, was very much kind of a warning of the madness that lurked within all of us.
Because the inmates of Bedlam were so starved of attention, were so neglected, for some of them, having members of the public coming in who they could interact with and sing and dance and converse with and shout at, would have been therapeutic, something that they wanted. But the point is, they didn't have a choice. And for everyone who would have felt like that, there was probably at least one for whom being on public display was excruciatingly shameful and painful.
Bedlam's governors had shrewdly calculated that mass tourism would generate a healthy income for the hospital.
Every person who visited Bedlam passed through the penny gates and had to put a few pennies into 2 life-size models of gypsies dressed in the Bethlem colours.
Visiting was not just a source of income for the governors, it was a source of income for patients, some of whom had ways of trying to solicit charity from the visitors.
They would quite often offer to